While We're Working is the show that helps you become a better leader of your small business or small team. I couldn't do an episode without our best consulting practice manager ever, Summer Keytron. Summer, how you doing?
Hey Joey, it's great. It's summertime over here in San Diego, and couldn't be happier that we're finally having these long days and it's not dark when we wrap up work around 5 or 5:30. But how are things going over there with you?
It's going great. My kids are out of school and it's confusing them that we're asking them to go to bed while the sun is still
I bet.
out.
Hopefully they get to stay up a little bit later then and enjoy all that summer break has to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. If dad has his way, they will, but mom is keeps a tight ship, so we'll see. We've got a pretty fun episode. I think these topics are like summer to-do list if we think about it, right? For your HR function at the office. So we're talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act to pump. The Department of Labor has issued guidance on it. We're going to tell you what it's all about. And then we've got a fun topic for Consultants Corner. We're going to be talking about I-9 verification for teams who are remote. It comes up from time to time, anytime you're hiring a new person or it's time to renew verification of, let's say, immigration documents. We were going to tell you a little bit about that. You don't want to miss it. As always, Jumpstart, we are your team to help with remote and outsourced HR and recruiting. We also offer certified disc assessment and coaching, as well as payroll support for organizations large and small. So let's go ahead and jump into this first while we were working segment. Summer, take it away.
Absolutely. Here's another great show with today's topics around compliance. I thought, gosh, I realize it's probably not very exciting for most, but one of the things that I hear from clients and others that I speak to is that it's really difficult when you're running a small business to stay current on all of the changes that apply to employers. So there's two that we picked we thought would be really relevant. And it wouldn't be our while we were working segment if we didn't say that we recognize you might have missed this because you were so busy working, so your friends at Jumpstart got you covered. So we're going to talk about there was some DOL guidance that was issued on the Pump Act in about mid-February. Now, this was a field assistance bulletin that was provided, and it essentially gives instruction to those within the agency who are responsible for enforcing this. It gives them additional clarity on how to interpret what was written. So we took a look at this because there's some real gems to take away from it. Because if you understand how it's going to be enforced, it's some real great guidance on how you should be developing your policies and administering your internal practices accordingly. So without further ado, uh, we'll chat about first why this exists and what we're talking about on a broader level before we dive into some of the details. Hopefully, if you're in HR small business, you've become familiar with just some of the protections that companies provide to their lactating employees. So, most importantly, providing what's considered reasonable time and private space so that these individuals can express breast milk. So we get a lot of questions on this because it, when it everybody was in what I call larger, more formal office space, it was a little bit different than maybe some companies now who are using maybe co-working spaces or shared spaces, or they've moved to a different space than where they were before, and they might not have that same area available or private space available for their lactating team members. Super important that everybody thinks through how they're going to comply with this if they haven't already, and to not wait until you have a need to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned a great point about the cowork because I know we'll dive into this act in a bit more detail, but there are so many employees these days who say, "Oh, I'm going to work from home," which is great. But then there are
Mhm,
those who say, "Oh, I'm going to work from the co-working space downtown or
mhm,
a coffee shop or
mhm.
this location." So you have to keep in mind that as an employer, you've got some obligation to
Mhm.
make sure that all of the
Yes, and when you dive into some of the details, I think the clarity that was provided this time is really helpful because otherwise, lack of clarity, it provides an opportunity for companies to interpret how they believe it was intended, and when you get it wrong, you may not be super clear that you're breaking the law, but you are. So the first one that this field assistance bulletin provided guidance on is what's called break time requirements. So essentially, companies that might have previously been taking a one size fits all approach, they've said that's not going to work. And that the time that your lactating team members have to pump, it can't be set. It doesn't have to be set. So if you have really rigid restrictions saying you can take your break at this time or that time, Pump Act says, nope, can't do that. And that remote worker, so we were talking about that co working environment, they need to be offered those same breaks and that same flexibility as anybody that's in the office.
yeah, I can remember. So I have two little girls, and first of all, I think it's such a it's not a weird topic, but I feel like I'm mansplaining, so I'm trying to staying in the safe space here. But just I would call my wife and just say, "Hey, how are things going?"
Mhm,
And any given point in the day, she might be expressing. It's just making sure that you give your colleagues that flexibility
mhm,
goes a long way in making sure that they feel welcomed as a parent, especially a returning to work parent,
mhm,
making sure that you thought out the idea of saying, "Hey, we're going to create a space for you. We're going to create a time for you," or not creating a time, but giving you the time and freedom
mhm,
to pick where you want to go or how long you need and where that needs to be.
mhm,
Super, super tough, I think, parameters for co-working, but maybe calling and speaking with a office manager of a co-working space and saying, "Hey, what are the legalities and options that you have for this
mhm,
pump back?" Because you better believe you're not the only company that has to abide by this rule.
mhm.
So you're better off going somewhere that's already thought about it than having to recreate the wheel and figure something
Mhm.
else out.
Yes, and you mentioned one thing that I wanted to point out because I glazed right over it, but I mentioned the schedule can't be set, but the time that's actually allowed can't be set either.
Mm.
Now, of course, it's up to the company and the team member to determine what's needed and what's appropriate. And is that going to be paid time versus unpaid time, right? Because assuming that somebody works a full 8-hour shift, they are entitled to a meal break and rest break. So I think just thinking through how does that work and making sure that they really just truly get the time that they need. But you also touched on space, Joey. So do you want to talk about that a little bit more together?
Yes, yes. I'll start with kind of a pet peeve of mine that I've had that I'm glad this Pump Act addresses, in that you cannot have an employee pump in the bathroom. I used to say, my wife used to say, you wouldn't eat your food in a bathroom, so why would you expect a nursing parent to express in a
Mhm,
bathroom? That just doesn't sound right.
mhm,
There are space requirements with this pump that says where you can and cannot pump, and
mhm,
what are some of the things that need to be set up in order to create privacy for
mhm.
the expressing. So do you want to drive into that a little bit more detail, Summer?
Sure thing. Of course I do. So, some of the guidance in this field assistance bulletin, it says this must be a place other than a bathroom and free from intrusion from coworkers and the public. They suggest that there are locking doors or signage that space is in use. Now, I will tell you that if you have an unlocked door, I can tell you with 100% certainty that your team members are not going to feel comfortable because at any point in time, even if there's a sign, somebody who's not paying attention could walk in. So while it's not required that it has a lock, it's suggested. But something that was a little surprising to me was that partitions or what they call a privacy screen is actually okay, but it has to be in a functional space. And the functional space definition actually applies to any lactating space. You have to have a place for them to sit, a place that has a flat surface other than the floor to place a pump, and they must be able to safely store their milk either in a fridge, a food container, or cooler that the team member provides. And it's also recommended for obvious reasons that there's electricity and that it's near a sink. So, very specific criteria that we haven't seen before in regards to these break time requirements, making them much more flexible, and then the lactation space requirements. So, I'm sure you can imagine, Joey, that in some businesses, this is going to be a little challenging for them to comply, either based on the nature of their business or their work site.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out there, jumping the gun a little bit, there are some exemptions to this, right? So if you are an
Mhm,
employer with 50 employees or less, you can claim an exemption for undue hardship. But thinking of all the different places and spaces that people work, whether it be warehouses or traveling sales agents or the coworker at the coffee shop or individuals who are dexless, maybe they work at a in a hotel lobby or like a car dealership. There are so many people who need to be thought of because any person who's able to produce milk is now a person in your employee population that you should be mindful of. Okay, in the event that they need to express milk, what's our plan to
mhm,
give them this peace of mind and abide by this act? You've got to have it, even if it's something you address once and you figure it out,
mhm.
you've got to at least address it once.
Yes, and if a company hasn't previously had to make plans for this, a really great time is as soon as you learn that your team member is going to have the need. So, that's going to give you a little bit of lead time to plan if you don't already have space and or plan for how are we going to navigate what could be potential breaks when this individual returns. And I know you mentioned the exemption, Joey, for small businesses, and that's absolutely correct. I would say if you're a small business and you hear, oh, cool, I can claim undue hardship and get out of this, I would just say proceed with caution. Simply because anytime you pursue something along those lines, you have to be very prepared to make a case for why you did that. But I think even beyond that, do you really want to have to go back to your team member who's, really trying to navigate both work life and new home family life and say, "So sorry, when you come to work, we can't help you." I think even if there's not a requirement that companies really evaluate the impact of claiming the exemption and only do it in extreme limited cases that there truly isn't a feasible option for them.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the saying where there's a will, there's a way. If
Mhm,
if you have colleagues that need these sorts of accommodations, I'm sure it's possible to figure
mhm.
something.
Yep, it makes me think about accommodating individuals with disabilities, right? And how there's also that provision in there that undue hardship to the employer is a potential way to avoid complying. But it's the same thing. It's if you're going to pursue that route, you better be absolutely sure that you have your ducks in a row if one of the agencies comes knocking on your door.
That's right. That's right. Because they do come a knocking.
They do.
All right. All right. Just to wrap it up with the bow here, click the link in our show notes description for access to the guidance on the and in order to make sure your organization is updated, you'll want to take down the guidance from August 2016 and replace it with the guidance from April 2023, which is the refreshed version of it. Let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit and jump into consulting. Consultant's Corner is. Oh, did you want to say something?
No, go for it. Go for it, Terry.
I'm so excited because we nerd out about these things, so I just go a mile in. But Consultants Corner, this is where we talk about a life as a consultant, the good, the bad, the ugly, here in the trenches, helping our small business client. This week, we have a question from a listener that says, what are our responsibilities with remote I-9 verification? I think this is an excellent topic, and I'll tell you why. First of all, small business owners, we found that when you start a business, you're probably excited about your product. You're probably excited about where you get an office or if you choose to work from home. You're probably excited about your tools, your software, the things that you're going to use to grow your business. And you might even be excited about hiring people and bringing them on board. But one thing that slips cracks so often is new hire paperwork. And so, broadly speaking, there are different paperwork that we find people omit or forget, or they just didn't know it was a thing. But this one adds a specific layer of complexity and importance because Form I-9 is required of anyone who wants to work in the United States legally, if you want to work legally. Now, if you want to work illegally, that's a podcast for another time. But legally, if you want to work for an employer in the States, you have to complete a Form I-9. But Summer, what do we do if the person works in Texas and I live in Colorado? What should we do? And what have you seen our clients do?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what's being done today and what's going to be changing here really quickly. Remote verifications have been permitted during COVID, and that is for individuals who it was essentially created because we weren't coming into the office, we weren't meeting in person. And if you're familiar with the I-9, one of the most important steps is not only completing it timely within the first 3 days, but it's that you are actually physically inspecting the document or documents that your new hire is presenting. So, a little bit of a problem if we're not allowed to meet in person. The USCIS essentially said up until July 31st of this year that remote verifications are permitted. So, what does that mean? That means that instead of meeting with that individual in person, that you can authenticate their documents through they have a list of methods, but a lot of people just scan them or they meet over video and share them. So there's a couple of different ways that it can be done, but that's all coming to an end at, at the end of July. And now what that means is that companies actually have to go back and all of those I-9s that they verified remotely, they now have to inspect those documents in person. Done.
Dun dun dun. Sounds like we're gonna be busy, Summer, because a lot of people have grown. Even in this economy, there are groups that have been hiring, and we've even been fortunate to bring some new members to our team in the midst of post-pandemic, quasi-recession, untold economy sort of environment. But so you're saying that we've got to go and inspect those documents. What should we do? How should we entail that? What's the kind of process that you'd roll out?
It's a lot of work if you've did some serious hiring during this period, and so if you have the opportunity to uh, start it now. And there's a couple of ways to do this, and I actually have a story to tell somewhere in here, but when inspecting documents in person, of course, if you've returned to the office and just asking somebody to bring their documents is the easiest way, the documentation that they initially provided. The USCIS also says that when you are re-verifying these documents in person, that you just go to the I-9, there's this big empty box that says additional information, and you would just write in there your name, your date, that you physically inspected the documents, and then you're done. But you actually can't skip that step. It's very important if you're audited. But Joey, I'm sure you've heard of a variety of other ways that companies have instructed team members to complete their in-person verification. Have you ever heard of individuals using notaries for this?
Yeah, I was gonna say you can go to a notary, which
Mhm.
makes it a little bit easier for you to get this done if team members are remote because you can walk into a bank, you can walk into a typically a realtor will have a notary or a company will have a notary. Locally in my neck of the woods, the UPS store has a notary. If I've got a package I need to return, I can also get them to sign something. And so notaries, and you might even have within your network of friends someone who's a notary. So
Yeah.
it's such a, and for those of you who never use a notary, in effect, it's a person who has a sworn duty to ensure that documents they sign are or documents that they witness are from the people who say they are, so they're not like pretending to be. I can't sign a document as Summer in the presence of a notary because I'm going to have to show the notary my documentation, and my name is not Summer, so I can't sign.
Right.
And Summer has way more hair than I do, so I that would look a little different. But a notary is a person who is actually sworn to carry out their duties and ensure the integrity of a document that's being signed.
Mhm.
And notaries help expand the reach of your ability to hire because
Mhm.
you would just need to find someone in there.
Mhm. And I find that many companies utilize that option because it's typically widely available. But if you're a company who's considering utilizing that option for the first time, there's definitely a lot of considerations to think of, such as providing instruction on where a team member should go. So, for example, Joey, like the UPS store. So, maybe the instruction is to all team members find your nearest UPS store, and the company will reimburse you up to some amount, maybe $50. And so submit your expenses here. So having a process rather than just telling your employees, hey, go take care of this and then leave it to them to figure out. But something really important, and I wanted to share this story. Something really important, or should I say interesting, that came up is buried in the guidance. There is a little bit of language that says who can actually complete the I-9 verification as the employer representative. And would you believe that it says anybody that the company authorizes can sign that?
So I'm curious, what does that mean?
Thanks, Joey. Thanks for setting up my stories. I'm going to explain that, but I want to share the story first, which is a couple of years back, one of my friends was starting their new job and they were reviewing their paperwork from HR and said, I don't understand this. Please, you're in HR. Tell me what it means in understandable English.
Hmm.
I said, they're asking you to take your documents to a family member or a friend and have them sign this form. And my first response was like, what? Like your family member can't sign the I-9 form? And I was adamant. I had never heard of this. I was adamant. I was like, no, like something is very wrong. He went back to HR and they said, no, like your friend, your family member can sign it. And I was like, fine, I'll sign it, whatever. But the really interesting thing is, I'd never heard of this. It's actually allowed. So anybody that the company authorizes can sign the form. So if the company is authorizing another member of your household or family or neighbor or anybody that can pick up a pen and sign the form, then that's actually acceptable. However, the company is liable for any violations. So
That's right.
I think that's the key in making sure you're selecting who you believe is trustworthy to act on behalf of the company.
It's certainly that, and it's also as for the employer listening, making sure you have a trustworthy person who's not going to provide forged or inauthentic
Mhm.
documentation to justify their hire.
Yeah, it seems like a really risky area, which is why I'm sure I hadn't seen that done before, but it was just really interesting to me that from an agency that is so rigid and has such specific requirements for these forms that there's actually a big piece of it that there's not a lot of restriction on.
Yeah, that's actually pretty crazy. I would have thought that. I guess I could see it. So I could see maybe, let's say, I don't know, a warehouse or crew environment where HR is somewhere in a central office, but the team is out in the field, I could see a world where it's, just complete it and get the paperwork to us. I could see that being the case.
Yeah.
But it definitely presents more risk because
Yeah.
even when you have the Form I-9, it's very particular how you have to complete it and fill it out. And
Mhm.
so if you have someone who's never done the document, you could even have all of the right information, but in the wrong place. And
Mhm.
that could present challenges of its own. I
Yep.
wanted to call out even the penalties for I-9 violations. Um, they range from $252 to $2,507 for first offense for
Mhm.
substantive violations or uncorrected technical errors. That's what I meant, right information in place.
Yep.
And then $1,161 to $2,332 for second and subsequent paperwork offenses. And then the penalty for recruiting, referring, and rehiring unauthorized non-citizens.
Mhm.
Those penalties are $627 to 5,016
Mhm.
for first offenses and for each knowingly employed unauthorized worker. So we're not talking about insignificant amounts here. These are pretty large amounts.
Yeah, and I would say even if you're a small business, to not overlook the importance of the I-9s and getting them right because while these agencies are busy, they're very active in pursuing I-9 enforcement, and if you don't think it's going to happen to you, those are typically the companies who unfortunately, it happens to, and they can show up at your workplace at any given time, request copies of your I-9s, and they can actually send workers home on the spot. So this happened to Chipotle a number of years ago. And when Chipotle could not produce the appropriate documentation, they actually had to close some of their locations because their I-9s were not compliant and they ultimately were not able to keep a large portion of those team members on staff.
Wow. Wow. So it's not just the little guy who's impacted by this. It's
Mhm.
big
Mhm.
brands can be impacted too.
Yeah, but just think about if you're, say, a small business of 5, 6 team members, I-9s haven't been your priority, and you receive an inspection. You have to send those team members home. They can't produce the documents needed, and now your business is
That's why you need a group like Start to help you make sure that doesn't become a problem
Mhm.
for your business. Any other thoughts, questions, things we should cover on this?
I feel like there's always so much to talk about in regards to compliance, but if you're following our show and you have questions about these compliance topics or anything else interesting that you're just curious about, like, how does this work?
Yeah,
Please reach out to us, hello at jumpstart-hr.com with your question, and we'd love to chat about it on a future episode.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Summer, as always, man, time flies when we're having fun. But if you want to hear us talk more about HR topics, we've got a full growing library over wherever you consume your podcasts and our YouTube channel. Great place to actually see us. So without further ado, see ya. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.